Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Stand before a giant sequoia tree in Sequoia or Kings Canyon National Parks or nearby Yosemite National Park, and you're overwhelmed by their size and assume that they're impervious to anything that might be thrown at them. But as we learned from wildfires in 2020 and 2021 in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, that's not the case. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. The Castle Fire in 2020 and then the KNP Complex and Windy fires in 2021 that burned through the two parks destroyed thousands of giant sequoia trees. Estimates put the losses at more than 14,000 mature trees on the high end, or roughly 13 to 19% of the world's giant sequoias. At the Sequoia Parks Conservancy, just days after the KNP Complex fires started in September of 2021, plans were made to begin raising funds to help the National Park Service restore and recover areas in the two parks that were burned. Today, we're discussing that ongoing recovery work with Savannah Boiano, the Executive Director of the Sequoia Parks Conservancy. We'll be back in a minute with Savannah.
Gear up for 2024 with Interior Federal Credit Union. Synchronize all your accounts in one place with their tool, Money Management. Money Management allows you to create budgets to fit your lifestyle, set up goals for the future, monitor your account and loan balances with one login, track debt, and more. Apply for membership at interiorfcu.org and sign up for digital banking to get started. Federally insured by NCUA. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Savannah.
Oh, and thank you very much for having me. Thanks for your interest.
No, it's an incredible story that's going on, both cataclysmic in what the wildfires did to the sequoia forest and now the recovery effort that's ongoing. Tell me a little bit about the Conservancy before we get into the meat of the story.
Sure. Sequoia Parks Conservancy is the nonprofit partner to Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, and we will celebrate 84 years of service to these two national parks this year. So we're very proud of our long legacy of service to these parks. We also have an additional partner of U.S. Army Corps of Engineer, Lake Cahuilla.
That's quite a span of time, 84 years. What was the Conservancy created to do, established to do?
Sure. Our first role was really one of education and providing books and maps, for wayfinding and enrichment, educational enrichment for early park visitors in 1940. And then it has expanded over time, continuing, providing education through, books and maps. And we've added other educational products that do tell these parks stories and broaden the stories that the parks tell through these products. We also provide education through a field institute, so you can hire a guide here in the park and extend your experience and understanding and appreciation of these parks. It's not a ranger program. The rangers offer, the free educational programs to the public, and we kind of extend that and deepen that experience. That's our niche that we hold down. And then in 2015, we added a philanthropy priority, and we are the park's fundraising philanthropy partner there.
Now, I'm wondering, you work on behalf of both parks, Sequoia and Kings Canyon, and in some respects, they're totally different parks. Everybody relates to Sequoia National Park because of the giant sequoia trees, and Kings Canyon has some sequoia groves as well, but it seems to be the high country that really differentiates Kings Canyon from Sequoia. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's really interesting that you pointed that out. I spoke with a reporter a couple of weeks ago, and he said to me, he had noted, the same thing that, they are two different national parks legislatively. They're managed as one since World War II. But he said, oh, no, I really prefer Kings Canyon National Park. So we know that people really connect to the two parks for different reasons. And I think in the Kings Canyon, it is the high country that draws the people. It's Cedar Grove, which, John Muir compared to Yosemite Valley, but without all the people there. It's a stunning, stunning canyon there. And in addition, when you're in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks or around, we're surrounded by the Sequoia National Forest and Sequoia National Monument. And
Sure.
so we get a wide audience of people who come through and really are connecting not only to the national parks, the stories of these two parks, which in some ways are distinct, but we're also meeting folks who are connected to these parks because of the national forests and the opportunities offered through the national forest.
And one thing that really points to the diversity of those two parks is while a lot of people focus on the trees or the high country, there's the subterranean aspect of the parks, the caves that are there. There are dozens and dozens of caves between those two parks, if not more. And that's an ongoing story of exploration and discovery.
Yeah, it is really a shocking park. There's, like you said, there are all of these caves, almost 200 subterranean caves, and that means we have an underground wilderness. And it is managed as wilderness, which is just a unique experience to be able to have in the United States, to know that we've got this vast network of underground wilderness. And above us, of course, we have these beautiful dark skies. So the opportunities to connect to your own story culturally and with your recreational interests, or scientific interests is just, I think there is something for everyone in these two national parks. It's really, really incredible.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think that goes to many, if not most, of the units in the national park system, that there seems to be one element that attracts people to them. But if they pause and look around and ask some questions, they'll find some incredible stories that will add to their adventure in the parks.
Correct. Yeah. And I would say, Kurt, if I could extend that just a little bit, one of the ways that the stories of the national parks are extended is when we get, new audiences into the parks and new kinds of employees in the parks who dig deeper and look for their own story and their own connections, and then become attached to those stories and begin to amplify them and bring them forward. And I think that is a wonderful part of the national park experience, is bringing forward conversations and topics and connections that are new. And so we always like to see our new visitors come in and ask questions that maybe someone hasn't asked before, or amplify discussions, or seek information and education on a topic that's maybe not as easily accessible, but then becomes, a major part of these national parks.
No, absolutely. Learning through others is a vital aspect of both the National Park Service and I think anybody who considers themselves a parks advocate, to share their opportunities or their experiences with others. Now, of course, the main reason we're here today, Savannah, is to talk about the wildfires that struck Sequoia and Kings Canyon in 2020 with the Castle Fire, and then the KNP Complex and the Windy Fire in 2021. I don't think anybody could have envisioned the devastation, if you want to call it that, that was felt by those two parks from those fires.
Yeah, devastation is definitely a word, and it's devastating on different kinds of levels. Of course, it's devastating on the kind of the life history and the ecology of giant sequoias and the mixed conifer forests that surround them. It's devastating culturally. Many of the middle elevation is got rich cultural sites for many different user groups in there, particularly our local tribal members, but other groups as well who have contributed to building these national parks and are part of the park story. It's devastating. I think we saw this really in the tribute gifts, emotionally to people who find, solace and awe and all kinds of, things that the breadth of the human experience expressed in these giant sequoia trees and in these two parks. So it's very, very real for people. And we saw that in the tribute gifts that, tribute expressions that came, with people's donations. And it's an unfolding conversation.
Yeah, and I wonder if devastation is the correct word. And I say that because I was in Yellowstone back in '88 when the wildfires burned through that park. And I was working for the Associated Press, so I was on the ground covering the fires. I spent a couple different stints in the park, and the first one, I thought, oh my gosh, this is devastating. And then the second time, I had a greater appreciation for wildfire and natural events and whatnot, and saw the rebirth that was occurring rapidly. I mean, before the fires were out, there was rebirth in some of the burn sections. And I'm wondering, is devastation the correct word? I mean, certainly things have changed since '88 and the Yellowstone fires. I mean, I don't think climate change was part of our vernacular back then. And today, we attribute climate change when we're talking about the types of fires that burned in California, the KNP Complex and the Castle Fire. Is devastation the right word, or is this natural?
I would say, it is devastating in some ways because it shatters our paradigm of what we thought we knew, and it shatters our assumptions about the natural world, and we have to rebuild from there. It was a leveling experience, I think, for a lot of people, whether you were in the park or whether you were really far away. I think it felt devastating. But, Kurt, you said something that's really important. With distance comes perspective, and you can see different things when you get that distance from a really big and kind of life-changing event like a fire like this. And I think that's what we see now is we've seen, kind of trying to rebuild these places and trying to build resilience into these places. I think the devastation, we've kind of got some distance from that. And now we're looking at just all of the very interesting things that we are learning as part of that rebuilding. And learning can be exciting. There is an exciting part of that. And I think that's part of what we're seeing right now. That, there's still the worry and, those elements in there that can be negative elements. They're still there, and we don't want to ignore them. And there is huge elements of hope and interesting, and look what we're learning that we would not have learned otherwise, or we might have learned a lot more slowly.
It was amazing how much of the giant sequoia forest that they burned. I mean, I think a lot of us tend to look at the giant sequoia trees and think, boy, they're so huge. They can repel anything. They've got bark a foot or so thick to, ward off flames from fires, and they actually need fires to release their pine cones and open up the serotinous cones so they can reseed the forest. This was like nothing anybody could have imagined, right?
Oh, yeah, it was huge, 16 giant sequoia groves, anywhere from, probably about 2,300 monarch giant sequoia groves. Monarch giant sequoias are the large diameter giant sequoias were lost during this. And, again, you think they're forever trees, and boy, forever can go up in flames pretty quickly. And that's what we saw during that time, is just fast.
Yeah, and I think between those three fires, I mean, they claimed roughly anywhere from 13 to 19% of the mature giant sequoias on Earth.
Yeah. Yeah. And the mortality rate, the history of the mortality rate, if have been watching the news releases over time, is just, I mean, that change between, less than 1% to, almost 19%, uh, in these last, 4 or 5 years is just really incredible. That's a big shift.
Yeah, yeah, and we're talking about how climate change has fueled the fires, not to be funny, but contributed to the intensity of the fires. At Yosemite National Park, they've done a lot of understory clearing around some of their sequoia groves, and they attribute that to lesser burn intensity in recent years. Was that a situation at Sequoia and Kings Canyon where they hadn't gotten around to clearing that tangle of undergrowth, or was this really just such an intense fire that nothing was going to stop it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we think of, there's roughly 75 groves of giant sequoias in the Sierra Nevada range, and roughly 30% are, fall within Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park. So it's a large number of groves are actually in these two national parks. We tend to think of them as, the giant forest and the ones that we'll see along the highway, but many of the groves are actually in remote locations and they don't lend themselves to easy management. So doing prescribed fires in places like the giant forest or, general Grant Tree area, the Big Stump area, Lost Grove, those are all right on the highway and they're very easy and safe to manage them. And they have been managed really well in that way. But as soon as you get out into the backcountry, into these really steep terrain, those wild groves can be very difficult to manage. The just the difficulty of accessing them. And then when you get there, they're on steep terrain. Some of them haven't, had any prescribed fire in 150 years or limited management in that many time in that span. So it spans the range from quite a bit of management in the front country to very little management in the back country, and you could see how when the fire got to those different kinds of groves with different kinds of management strategies and access, you could see how the fire responded to the management or less management.
Right, right. And then turning to climate change, here in the Southwest where I live, we've been under drought for more than 20 years. And I know there was drought in California until the winter of 22-23, which was quite the winter for California. But that was an anomaly in recent time. And climate change has led to, I believe, lesser snowpack and a snowpack that melts off earlier in the spring than usually used to do. And then with that snowpack gone, the drying starts. And that all contributed to the intensity of these fires, no?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So extensive drought, like you've said, and when you have events like a long drought, then it's not only a factor of having less water, then there are effects of having less water, right? So you've got, tree dieback, or the trees are more vulnerable to things like beetle infestation, which can kill them, right? Different kinds of fungus, again, that can kill them. And so you've got these kind of after effects of the drought itself that are making the forest more vulnerable to that kind of death and, what we call a lot of dead standing trees. Right. So
Right.
it's not just a factor of drought. It's, that all of the other things that come along with drought.
Yeah, yeah, all the contributing factors. And because of the fire burned so hot and so intense, it really baked the soil, and it, as I understand it, incinerated any sequoia seeds that were on the ground, as well as some in the tree crowns themselves?
Yeah. Yeah. And, typically if you would have, if we look at the fire regime pattern in a giant sequoia grove, you know, fires creep along in a giant sequoia grove. Of course, the only natural introduction of fire into any ecosystem is lightning, right? And when lightning strikes in a giant sequoia grove and starts a fire, it might, creep around on the forest floor, and it's a lower intensity fire. For those of you who are listening in the audience and want some perspective on this, you think of, you have a candle with a yellow flame, and then you have your stovetop, right? Oven or stovetop kitchen, and you might have a really high blue flame, and you might take, as a kid, you would take your finger and run it through the candle, that yellow flame, be like, wow, look at me, I'm not burning. Right? But you're not going to do the same thing when you're looking at a gas stove, right? With that blue flame, you're not going to stick your finger in there, right? So fires can have different temperatures themselves. And so when in a giant sequoia grove, naturally fires will go through and they'll creep along, and the heat generated from the natural debris in the area is relatively low. In this case, what happened was the temperature of the flames based on the debris on the ground was extremely high, unusually high, right? It would be equivalent to sticking your finger in that blue flame in the stove. And that's something that, giant sequoia groves, giant sequoias are not, it's just not the norm for them. And so it'll, burn up everything in its wake, leaving the groves themselves not prepared for natural regeneration.
Right, right. Now, the numbers that we're seeing out there, 88,000 total acres of habitat burned in the parks, and 16 groves were impacted to various degrees, more than 4,000 acres of sequoia groves, thousands of trees lost, literally thousands. Maybe as many as 10,600 trees lost to the Castle Fire in 2020. We're talking mature trees, and another 2,300 to 3,600 lost to the KNP Complex and the Windy Fire. I mean, we're always talking about mature trees. What about immature trees? Do we have any sense on how many immature trees were lost or how many survived?
I don't actually have that number handy with me. It is important to consider age classes within a forest. A healthy forest, you want to see those different age classes exist, and I just don't have the number here prepared with me. But it really is important to have the different age classes, and so that the production of giant sequoia seeds or any pine cones really is kind of an ongoing process. As these trees mature, you're
Right.
also having the cones mature and the seeds mature as an ongoing, not all maturing at the same time and all dropping seeds, viable seeds and cones at the same time.
Right, right, right. And then you touched on one of the other threats, kind of unrelated to fire, but the cedar bark beetles
Yeah.
that are infesting, some of the sequoias. In the Rocky Mountain interior, you've got pine bark beetles and spruce bark beetles and whatnot. And I understand that they've been able to survive better than in past years because it hasn't gotten cold enough in the winter times. Is that the reason why there have been cedar bark beetle problems in the sequoias? Hasn't been cold enough to kill them all?
Yeah, it's really an ongoing story. So I'm not sure that I would be able to give you something definitive, but certainly it's a place where we're starting, right? Um, that, the winters are shorter here. The winters are warmer here. It's called the Sierra Nevada for a reason. Nevada meaning snow, so the snowy range. And that snowy range, the snow window is getting shorter. And so that lengthens the growing and reproductive seasons for even the native species of bark beetle, the cedar bark beetle. And so even right now, as we speak, scientists are trying to get a handle on what they thought they knew about this native beetle. compared to what now is being revealed as a result of climate change and, less snow, shorter winters, more precipitation. And so I know that we will begin to see more of that story coming forward as scientists, understand or begin to understand these bark beetles.
Yeah, that's one post-fire story that will continue for years, I'm sure, is the science that these fires prompted, into not just their causes and their spread, but to all these other aspects, such as the bark beetles and whether they're more prolific, have more generations in one season than they used to have. What about wildlife habitat? How have the fires impacted wildlife habitat in these two parks?
Yeah. So, in 88,000 acres, there's a whole lot of habitat in there, and definitely severely impacted the habitat in some key areas. And we do have an endangered species, the Pacific fisher, and they are on the ground right now, really trying to inventory the fishers themselves to learn, what the population is like and where the population is, and their reactions to the KNP fire versus areas that were in the KNP fire but not as heavily impacted that would still be, in Pacific fisher habitat. We've got, I think there's frogs and reptiles that are also in there. So we've got some partners that we've been working with just to go in and inventory or re-inventory those, the population of those animals, and then starting to take an inventory of the habitat loss and impacts for those critters.
Yeah. We're talking today with Savannah Boiano from the Sequoia Parks Conservancy about the wildfires that struck Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks in 2020 and 2021. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
National Parks Traveler has launched the National Parks RVing Guide, the definitive guide for RVers seeking information on campgrounds in the National Park system. The guide is now available free through the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. If you're a traveler who wants to explore the National Park system, you'll want this app. The guide is packed with details for campgrounds in more than 70 national parks across the country, searchable by park, state, or region. You'll also find feeds of the traveler's content, including our latest stories and podcasts. Download the National Parks RVing Guide and start planning your next trip today. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smoky's Life is a biannual magazine produced by Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokiesinformation.org.
Savannah, I haven't had a chance to get out to the parks since the fire. I know it's early February, and so nobody's probably getting out to the parks. But last fall, before the snows came, what was the landscape like in the areas that burned?
It was not what I expected, Kurt. When I first returned after the fire started in Sequoia National Park, in 3 locations in Sequoia National Park. And one area was quickly extinguished, and then the fire, that started at Crystal Cave merged with the fire that started in the Mineral King area. They merged to become the KNP Complex. And I really thought of them as Sequoia National Park fires. So when I left the Sequoia Park entrance station on those first days, when we actually had access, I expected to see just wholesale devastation in Sequoia National Park. And it is terrible in some areas. And in other areas, you really can't tell as much that there was a wildfire. However, when I left Sequoia National Park, taking the General's Highway north towards Kings Canyon National Park, that's where I saw the greatest devastation. It was just a really, really intense wildfire over there. That, there's it's just toothpicks, honestly, in many areas. And I was not prepared. I think I'm still speechless, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Just how hot and intense the fire was over there. I had not predicted that at all.
Yeah.
And then, you go to these lovely areas with like, oh, great. Okay, it's still really wonderful in that area. But, the patches are like, whoa, okay, there was an intense fire here.
Yeah, I'm wondering because, like I said, I was in Yellowstone in '88, and those fires started in late June, and it wasn't until early September when a snowstorm came through that they were finally put out. But in August, you could find burned areas where there were wildflowers. The next spring, you would see the lodgepole pine seedlings coming back up. Nothing like that at Sequoia and Kings Canyon.
Oh, yeah. There's always lovely things that come up after a wildfire. Yeah, in the areas that were intensely burned, no, it just is still very quiet in those areas ecologically. So we don't see a whole lot of wildfires, but the areas that were burned to a lesser intensity, so beautiful, so pretty with the wildflowers. And it, gives you an experience where you really can begin to see the sunlight reaching the forest floor in a different way than it had before. And it just great stuff. You can go anywhere in this kind of lesser burned area and just see some beautiful stuff. And
Right.
it kind of it leads you down a path, right? And that's the funny thing about fires. The fire comes through and it burns to whatever degree it's going to burn. And myself, I find it almost as, like it creates a new path for me, a new path of appreciation and understanding and curiosity. Right. So I find myself even, I walked out to Sunset Rock, which is in the Giant Forest area, and it was impacted by the KNP Complex. And I found myself just driven by my own curiosity. And then I would see one wildflower and then just see this carpet of wildflowers. And then, my brain was like, wait, what's going on here? And it, you get that lovely, just like, I want to understand. And fire is a real teacher. When you kind of remove the emotional aspect there, it is a real teacher and it is a real guide to a place, and it guides you to the kind of the dark underbelly sometimes, but it also guides you to these just wonderful highlights of things that you might not have noticed before, or you might not have had a reason to stop and appreciate them. And certainly this wildfire did that in a lot of areas, just really causes you to step back and go, wow, I can see things that I did not see before.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm guessing that the Park Service is busy at work to interpret some of those areas for visitors in the coming months. We're post fire. We're into the recovery period, the restoration period. Does the Park Service have the budget to come in after an event of this size and be able to get in there on the ground and work on restoration, work on recovery?
That's a great question. So immediately following the KNP Complex wildfire, Congress actually did allocate a special appropriation, recovery allocation to Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. Much of that money was dedicated towards, restoring infrastructure that was lost or heavily impacted during the fire. Roads are a great example. Those are always affected by big fires, sewage, electricity, phone lines, buildings. There was a lot to restore, repair, or rebuild. And thanks to Congress for doing that. They saw the need and responded immediately. They also allocated a little bit of money towards that ecological restoration, but not as much towards the infrastructure. They really lean into the tangible things there. And
Sure.
that's where partners like Sequoia Parks Conservancy come in to the mix, where, we can provide flexible flexible funds for these restoration areas that are not covered by special appropriations. And so that's, we chose, the fire started on September 9th. By September 12th, we had a plan approved by the National Park Service to raise $1 million to fill in those gaps where, special appropriations or the park budget wouldn't be able to absorb the need or respond to the need for any kind of future restoration efforts. And just to give your listeners kind of some context, it's more than, when you're talking about restoring an area, it's more than just putting a road and calling it good and now you're off and running. The effects of these fires will be felt for years and years to come, and we will continue to learn about the effects of the fire and what's needed to restore an area and or build extra resilience into an area so that when another climate-related event comes to pass, we're better prepared for something like that. And that's where our funding comes in, is that the funding is what's called no-year funding. So the park can use it as new discoveries or needs for repairs or study, scientific study kind of emerge. Then Sequoia Parks Conservancy is prepared with funding to help learn and help restore, repair those areas.
Yeah. And of course, your campaign is called The Big Give. You've had $1 million goal. Have you reached that yet?
We're really close. We're 3/4 of the way. So actually, I think we're more than 3/4 of the way. I'm sorry. Yeah. So we're close. Our goal, we're going to finish this fund this year. But the parks have already been applying. We didn't wait to say, okay, we have to wait until we've got the $1 million goal. We didn't wait. We were there with the money, ready to apply that right away.
Sure. Is $1 million enough?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it's not enough. But it's what we decided at the time,
Yeah.
But we do have, we are constantly fundraising for the national parks, and we do have other funding pots available so that, as the KNP funding gets exhausted, we've got a Giant Sequoia Conservation Fund. We've got kind of a cultural resources fund. We've got all different little pots of money that the parks can apply to use that funding, to kind of rebuild.
Yeah. You use that word apply. I was wondering about it. Is it just a blank check that goes to the Park Service, or do you have to discuss what they want to use the money for before you send them the money?
Yeah, I say apply, but really what I mean is that Sequoia Parks Conservancy offers grants to the National Park Service, and they apply, they, build up a project, they build up a budget, they build up, they tell us what they hope to achieve, what outcomes and outputs that they hope to achieve through this funding. And then we work closely, with our board of directors to vet all of the asks. And then we determine what meets kind of our criteria the best and matches closely with our mission, and then matches closely with our purpose. And then we will grant them the funds.
Can you say what some of the money has been spent for already?
Yeah, sure. We've funded some Pacific, again, a Pacific fisher, which is an endangered species in these parks. We've funded Pacific fisher research. We have funded some tribal consultations. Like I said before, the KNP complex affected the middle elevation of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. And the middle elevations has a very rich cultural significance for all of our tribal members and tribal communities. And so they have been an integral part of restoring these areas and doing surveys. And we want to make sure that they're involved at every step of the way. And so we've funded some of that work. We have funded replanting of giant sequoia groves in some areas. We've funded cone and seed collection so that they can germinate giant sequoias again to replant in those areas. So a lot has been going on with this funding. Public education, we funded public education, rebuilding providing those wayside exhibits. We did have a great film where they flew over the Redwood Canyon Grove. So we applied some funding there. And our whole purpose is really, we want to put the funding where it, again, is going to go to the greatest good for giant sequoia conservation for the future. And we hope that it will also be in areas where visitors, their experience is enriched because of this particular restoration effort. So we want visitors to very much, benefit from our funding and the visitor experience.
Right, right. You mentioned reseeding, replanting, I believe. That's been a little controversial in some areas. No, isn't there a lawsuit that was filed by some groups that didn't think it was appropriate to reforest in wilderness areas?
Yeah, there is an ongoing lawsuit, and you can find out more from the National Park Service on that one. But I understand, there is a lot of emotion that goes along with this, and there's a lot of emotion that goes along with, what the American public thinks should go on in national parks or not go on in national parks, and what all of the words in the Organic Act mean, right? And how we interpret them. And, one of my favorite things to say is it is a conversation. National parks are where the great American conversation about our values lay. And they're not always comfortable conversations, and we're lucky that we can have them. And in that conversation, Sequoia Parks Conservancy is a proud partner of the National Park Service, and we do rely, on their science, their interpretation of the science, and then that's what we use in order to grant the money to the National Park Service. But I understand, and it's okay. And at some point, we'll all agree on how to move forward in those areas.
I'm not sure we'll ever all agree on anything, but you mentioned the Organic Act, and the Park Service long has said we're going to let nature take its course, and we're not going to intervene. And with the advent of climate change, you've had the argument put forth that because climate change is driven by mankind, that this is no longer nature taking its course, and so it's appropriate when necessary to step in, whether it's replanting giant sequoias in wilderness of the two parks, or whether it's bringing wolves back to Isle Royale National Park because it's too warm for the ice bridges to form to allow the wolves from the mainland Canada to come to the island. It is an interesting debate, and I'm not sure it'll ever end, and not sure we'll come to a consensus on, is the Park Service playing God in wilderness areas, or are they being responsible stewards of these lands and the wildlife within them?
Yeah, it's extremely challenging. When you look at the life history of giant sequoias over the millennium and the mortality rate, and when 19% of the world's mature giant sequoias are killed in 14 months, right? That gives you pause, and it at least for me, it makes me really look at what's relevant these days, right? And when the Organic Act was written, the world was a very different place. And why our motivation for writing the Organic Act, and our motivation for these national parks, and our motivation for every word that went in there was seeded from a different place.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't from the place that we find ourselves in today. And yet it is a document, it's a foundational document. And so how do we move forward in this era of urgency, and they were, how do we do that? And I don't, none of us have the answer necessarily. And I think that's what we're working out as a public, but that sense of urgency is completely different we are not, trying to continue nation building like we were, proving ourselves on the world stage, as we were. This is now, this is a climate emergency. And how can we use the Organic Act and the laws that have since come from the Organic Act, and how can we use the most relevant science to move the needle forward and caretake these places and steward these places? It's really a challenge.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer to these challenges, but I guess I would argue that we need to, my challenge would be, moving forward and saying, okay, well, that was true then. What do these words mean to us now, when in the light of climate change? And how would we rewrite the Organic Act knowing what we know now?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm sure it's one that's going to continue to be asked and debated. And wildfires are not the only impact brought by climate change, the intensity of the wildfires. There are other impacts that climate change brings, whether it's drought or warmer temperatures that allow cedar bark beetles or other species to survive, and to the detriment of other species. We had a story on the Traveler a few weeks ago about the John Muir home and how he had brought a sequoia sapling down from the high country to plant in his yard, and how this tree, just never gained the height of a mature giant sequoia because it was in the wrong place. And so, I'm wondering, with climate change impacts growing, what other threats the giant sequoia forest might encounter.
It's a really good question. I don't know that we know the answer to these questions. I do think it's, it is an interesting question, and that is one that, the best scientific minds, I think, are trying to tease out right now. I'm not the expert in the field of giant sequoias, and
Sure.
I'm not a scientist. And then the other hand is that, I would say that because, we've kind of put in suspended animation some of these charismatic megaflora, megafauna stories. We've put them on a shelf and said, here, we're going to park you here for a while because we think you're okay, right? Without really, continuing that pressing investigation into their life history and story and management. And so I think it's, this fire has been a call to action of like, hey, there is nothing that can remain on the shelf where, you're okay. This got taken off the shelf. Like, we immediately have to learn a lot that we should have been learning, all along. We just thought, well, they're doing fine. We had a certain narrative around them, and that narrative is shockingly less relevant than it was before, certainly, right? And so, this is partly why I can't answer your question, because there's just so much to be learned right now. It's not that we weren't curious, it was just that there were other pressing things at the time, and now this is our new pressing thing, right? And so we're doing a lot of catch up, I think.
Right. Now, as we mentioned, you've got the Big Give campaign. You're closing in on a $1 million goal that you set. How can folks contribute, the folks who haven't contributed and who might bring you closer to that goal?
Sure, thank you. So we invite everybody who's listening to donate. And so you can donate at sequoiaparksconservancy.org. You can mail us a check. And, we take PayPal, of course. All of your donations are secure, and we don't rent or sell any of your information here. And then, of course, we like to, I do actually sign all of the thank you letters. I like to see all of the donations. It just means a lot to me, Kurt. I know my staff even think it's ridiculous, and, isn't there a more efficient way to do it? And no, there's not, Kurt. Every person who donates is a person who took the time and the intention and loves these trees. And the least I can do is to, say a mental thank you to each of the donations and sign each of those letters. And some people are, repeat, donors, and I thank them nonetheless every single time, but it's an important activity. Our donors aren't cookie cutter people. They're people who really care a whole awful lot. And so I want to spend even a moment with them.
That's Savannah Boiano, the Executive Director of the Sequoia Parks Conservancy. Savannah, thanks so much for joining us today, and best of luck with your campaign. As we all know, the Park Service is underfunded, and every little bit that comes from outside groups such as the Conservancy is a big help.
All right, thank you so much for your interest in the story of the KNP Complex wildfire and our effort to help the National Park Service here on Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks.
That's our show this week. We hope you found it interesting. Again, you can help the Sequoia Parks Conservancy reach its $1 million goal for aiding the National Park Service with fire recovery and restoration efforts in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks with a donation. You can find out how to make that donation by visiting the Conservancy's website, sequoiaparksconservancy.org. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.